Welcome to a Women Powers panel.
Yes.
Okay, so we have on my right side, it's Paula-Irene Villa Braslavsky. I hope I said it more or less fine, Irina. Paula. Paula is also professor for sociology and gender studies at Ludwig Maximilian University. This is Bavaria, this is Munich. I know you all know Munich, there's no problem. Her research focus is also on gender theory, social theory, biopolitics, care, parenting, cultural studies, embodiment, gender and politics, popular culture. And I have to say she's also an academic activist because she's one of she fought at BFG, that is the German Fachbespiel, to have a funding line for gender studies and a commission for gender studies, and she is really well known also for the transfer of her knowledge to other medias. I think it's very important also for us. We discussed yesterday.
Okay. Muito obrigada. Muchas gracias por haberme invitado. Es un gran honor y un privilegio estar acá. Felicitaciones por el centro y por también este programa y estos días. Estoy aprendiendo muchísimo. Y bueno, I'll switch to English now and move on. I've prepared rather quite a bit, so I hope I'll be in time. I'm going to put my timer on. Okay, so I come from the research, and that's what I'm going to present here on two topics I'm trying to relate to each other. So the first one would be that I, with many colleagues, also some in Latin America, especially I'll just mention Sonia Correa, for example, here in Brazil, we have been studying, observing, analyzing the so-called anti-gender movements, anti-gender mobilizations. You have a lot of that here in Brazil, but it's also elsewhere in Latin America. I've dealt with this especially in Germany and in Europe. So these are just some impressions. I've been looking with colleagues at the kind of general dynamics of this anti-genderism or anti-gender movements and their regional specificities. And I'm not going to go into much detail here, just summarizing that what we found, and this is especially valid for the German context and applies to probably many others as well, that gender in the rhetoric of these anti-gender movements, which I would now, for the sake of being brief, locate within the right, but they are not limited there. We, especially in Germany, have a strong left critique that goes along very much the same lines here, but we could discuss this maybe later on. But the rhetoric suggests within these movements that gender is a kind of totalitarian ideology. Thus, for example, in German, it's with this suffix of ismus, like Faschismus or Sozialismus, which indicates a kind of ideological totalitarian stance, thus often called as, or labeled as genderismus. Then that gender is an element of, again, a kind of totalitarian political correctness discourse that's kind of forced upon us, the people, that's top down, forced through policies on, for example, students or others. Then a very important trope, and I guess you're very familiar with that here, that gender, that's the assumption that gender has a lot to do with the sexualization or even pornification, especially of children, and is very immediately linked to pedophilia, where, for example, and you see some images here, the so-called concerned parents think or protest against, for example, sexual education in schools, or even gender awareness, whatever, in schools or even kindergartens, that is necessarily a kind of pedophilia, or that these are pedophile practices. At the core of all these or defamations, I'd say, there is the idea that gender in itself, as a concept, as a framing, as a perspective, is itself the denial of nature. it's a kind of artificial code that denies nature and natural facts as they are in regard, for example, to sex, sexuality, gender, and is also then morally the denial of a common sense that we know how gender is, we know, how sexuality works, we know what bodies mean, so we don't tell us about gender because we know how it is, and that is very strong. It works very much as a kind of marker of we, those who have the common sense, we, the people, and thus gender is kind of seen as an artificial, external complexity brought into an otherwise socially and morally by nature structured and good and already structured world. The other problem is that within gender is seen as a kind of hyper individualistic trope according to which people kind of freely and loosely and randomly maybe even choose their gender and self-fashion their gender, and that would go against all kind of either religiously founded or naturally founded perceptions of gender as or sex and gender as naturally given. And finally, and that's a very strong trope in Europe, especially in Western Europe, an anti-European, anti-EU stance. That is, gender is part of the EU. Gender is Brussels speak. Gender is gender as in gender mainstreaming, and thus, again, an authoritarian top-down logic. And then it's associated with a kind of corruption and the waste of public funds and money by us, a globalist elite, and us who are obviously detached from the real people and their real problems, because we are kind of, as someone said yesterday, in our ivory towers, apparently destabilizing the natural social order. So this is very summarized what we have found, and this we've published a lot on this, and you might want to look at it, especially the red book here. That's a kind of international work we've done with many chapters, but specifically on Europe. And we see, and I would, for the sake of being brief again, say that what we see here is a new, but not at all original kind of anti-modernist somehow rhetoric and practices. It's been in modernity, if you want, all along, by saying that modernity is kind of an artificial wrongdoing to an otherwise natural and morally correct world. It works. Gender and genderism works very well in what we're seeing now, this populist antagonisms, we the people with our common sense, they the elites up there with their mobility and their fluidity and their gender choosing performances, etc., etc. It's a very anti-pluralist discourse, and it simplifies many things, and that's, I think, very easy to see. But and I very much agree with what Paulo presented yesterday in this regard, and I very much adhere to that. It's all very fine and well if we have kind of a moral outrage about this, if we are very critical about these movements. It's all well and very important, but I think that research should go deeper and understand better what is actually at stake here. It's really easy to say these people are just simply stupid because they need simplicity. And that's a very common argument you'll find in academia as well, a kind of ontology of the need to simplify, which I find totally not understandable. I don't think there is a kind of natural drive for people to be as simple as possible or want to make our social worlds as simple as possible. That's just empirically not the case. We all more or less are able and willing and find much, I think, joyance in also complex life worlds. But what I'm saying here is that I think to just say people are somehow stupid is not enough of an analysis, and also just to remain in this kind of ontological argument that, yeah, people just need less complexity is not really a satisfying analytical answer. And that's where I would put care in, and that's my second kind of work where I come from, the what I do research on. I think, and that would be my hypothesis here, I think that within these anti-genderist movements globally, but I'm looking at especially Europe and Germany here, There is one, among many, but one important promise, and that is the promise made by these anti-gender, especially right-wing movements, is the promise of care. That is, an answer to an ongoing and very acute crisis of care and of labor and of, in the end, the social organization of exactly these elements of care and of labor. So I think we're touching here with a core element of our topic here of sociality and conviviality, because care is crucial to conviviality and to how societies organize the possibility or impossibility of care. And again, I'd say that care is part of and is structured by inequalities and regimes of differences. And we could, I think, there link also to the issues of intersectionality, because these differences of gender, of sexuality, of class, of age, of ethnicity, or more even maybe nationality, are crucial here. For example, the entire migration issue within care, etc. I'll get to this. So I think that that's where maybe there might be a bridge here. Very briefly, again, looking at the German situation. Germany now is marked, and that's research-wise where I maybe come from, so I'll summarize this. Germany today has gone through, and this is both true for East and West Germany, through what we might call neoliberal re-regulation or transformation of the formerly conservative familialistic welfare state. And this latter is only true for West Germany. We have this interesting situation, as you know, in Germany having an East and West Germany, the East German past being kind of a real socialist model, West Germany, the capitalist, very conservative, very traditional familialistic welfare state. And what we see now, through decades now of partly social democratic neoliberal reshaping, we see new regulations of markets, labor, private, public, etc., also of care work, with a very strong expansion as globally of financial market capitalism. But these dynamics are ambivalent, because at the same time and within these processes, we've also seen, especially for West Germany, a very strong actual improvement of the situation, especially of female, remunerated female labor, much more women in the labor force, much more recognition for women also as in the labor market. We've also seen an important, and I think really it's important to acknowledge this, a rise of equality and anti-discriminatory policies with much more recognition also legally for example, several genders, for women, in labor regulation, etc. So much more, I'd say, inclusion and recognition of women, of mothers, of all, but only and insofar they accord to the adult worker model. So all of kind of emancipation, of recognition, of inclusion, also of civil rights, has gone through, as in many places, through paid labor through the market. So that's the main vein of inclusion and recognition. And that, of course, is a very ambivalent process, because it leaves out all the question of care and the inclusion and recognition that would go along with this. I won't go into the details here, but it is important to understand that while this is true, what I just said, a much stronger inclusion of women, of mothers into the labor market in especially West Germany and also in East Germany, we still have in Germany a very important and very structural and high gender care gap, not only a pay gap, but also a gender care gap, as also worldwide, where women, even if they work in labor, paid labor, do a far bigger share of what is considered care work. And they do so especially after and if they have children. So we know that, for example, the hours worked outside of care work and outside of house when men become fathers rises. So they work more outside of the family and the private context, and mothers far less. Women in Germany, especially in West Germany overall, are very much included into the labor market, but on part-time levels. So that's a very precarious and part-time inclusion into labor. That's the way the German model works, that women especially are overwhelmingly in part-time work, especially as mothers, and men or fathers are not. This for then care means, and I'll get to what care means in a moment. I'll try to define it, but just, with your maybe everyday notions, cuidado, care, for in this sense means that we have huge care gaps which are commodified, are turned into and are partly professionalized, so that are services that are paid for, they are bought. And this means more or less precarious situations for those working in the care sector, but also for those depending on having to externalize care duties or care issues. It means that we have a huge precarization and care drain in other countries because and precarious care work, because especially West Germany, but in the whole of Germany, imports a lot of care work in a semi-legal way through especially European migration. We have live-in, for example, care for the elderly is overwhelmingly done by more or less legal or semi-legal migrants, for example, from Poland or Moldavia or the former Yugoslavia, depending on the region, which are in very, very precarious conditions. We have for the entire kind of care sector where it's labor, be it hospitals or places for elderly people, kindergarten, hospitals, etc., a strong shift of these institutions towards a profit economy. It didn't used to be that way in West Germany some decades ago, but it's become that way. So we have what some call the McDonaldization of care, where it's become again very cheap and precarious labor. And referring back to what I just said on the migration issue, women's and female care labor especially is strongly racialized. So it's not only a migration issue, but that also goes along with racializing this labor. And that again would be an interesting topic and it is actually for intersectional analysis, how the laborers Thailand or Philippine woman or the clean and hardworking Polish woman, etc. So there's a lot of racializing going on there as well. All this feeds into a still ongoing logic of externalization of care. Externalizing care is the way still the German context deals with this care issue. And again, this externalization is embedded in structures of inequality and regimes of difference. Now, this all unfolds, and I'll hope I can make clear why I think this is important. This all unfolds in a situation in which this kind of optimization imperative is, I think, an important element of our contemporary social condition. That is, with a colleague, Ulrich Bröckling, I speak here of optimization imperative, and that means that we have a kind of intensified individualization ideology. This is not only true for Germany, but it is true for Germany. And I mention this because I think it's important that within these optimization logics, what we have very strongly, that's why I put Michelle Obama here, because I think she's an excellent example of this, and I've worked on her embodiment and her arms also. This implies that the self shapes itself in a kind of post-structure way, post-gender. post-racialized, post-class, post-heritage, whatever. That is this kind of, you make and you become the one, you make yourself into the one you think you should be. That's the old kind of promise of modernity. And now it's kind of intensified through logics of denaturalization of all sorts of socially relevant categories. To say, gender doesn't, or sex and gender don't matter that as they used to. Class doesn't matter any longer. Ethnicity doesn't matter. Sexuality doesn't matter. It is what you make of yourself, and a kind of post-categorical move. And that's, I think, a very strong kind of zeitgeist, a very strong programmatic element, a discursive maybe element of our contemporary condition. So it's a kind of pseudo post-structural, not in the theoretical sense, but empirical sense, to live a life that's kind of beyond certain structures. To refer to social structures is really a kind of victim speech, is something that really kind of discredits you in social life. And this implies an autonomous self that constantly shapes itself and makes itself and creates itself according to imperatives, for example, as labor market needs, mobility, fluidity, strength, resilience, etc. And it includes, or it suggests a kind of radically autonomous subject. And this, again, is totally the opposite, I think, of what care is. Care as an element of ourselves, of our social nature, and of society. So that's why back to care and defining care. And I think that's a core element of a problem, because we've lost kind of sight of what care actually is. I'd say with many authors that care is the ability and the capacity to be affected by the needs of the living in a broad sense. And this touches multi-species care, this touches ecology, this touches human, interrelations, animals, etc., etc. So being affected by the needs of the living and being able and willing to respond, to turn back and to respond to these needs is what care is about, is a kind of committed response to the needs of the living. So it can be, and it comes along in many different forms. It can be labor, it can be paid, it can be committed, it can be long-lasting, it can be very, very volatile, it can be a certain moment, it can be private, it can be not remunerated. It is associated with violence and dependency, but it's also a part of what brings joy and a sense to life. Care is part of our social nature, and without care, just to say it once very basically, nobody survives without care, and we are not able to live as individuals without care, nor are societies able to live without care. And we've really lost sight of these issues in, for example, the contemporary German situation. So this is, again, another definition. I think now that given the situation we have in Germany, and I try to very briefly sketch out, we have a generalized, and this is in terms of a social affect and a strong discomfort, a general discomfort by the increasing inability to really do and offer and also receive care. So there is a strong anxiety, a generalized anxiety regarding how to combine care and paid labor, and how to manage this, because this is extremely individualized, as you know, work-life balance and these kind of neoliberal terms. So how to combine these issues is totally individualized, and it's also very ideologically and fundamentalistically loaded. I think part of the problem is also that care has been kind of silenced. It's coming back, but silenced within also kind of emancipatory feminist discourse. It's always been there, but at least for the German situation, care has really not been part of a audible and visible feminist discourse. That's changing right now, I think. And so this all generates a strong kind of resentment against market and globalizing logics of optimization, of mobility, of globalization, etc. And this is where anti-gender discourses in the right, I think, come in, because they offer on a rhetorical level to take care of family, that the promise is we will empower you, we will enable you to be a family, and especially a so-called traditional family. That is what you need, and that is what you want. We want men to be able to earn enough to really have be able to provide for their family, so that she doesn't have to work outside family, and so that they are so that the promise, the offer is you will be able then to lead a normal, a traditional, the good life, including all the care needs you may have. So the populist promise here is to protect the family, the children, the private sphere from state. And that's why I was a bit, discussing with you yesterday. I think that the promises here have a strong kind of anti-statal drive built in, but we can discuss this. So the proposal is to return to the normal, the proper family, and against what's called defamiliarization and market logics of intending or having to give children away, etc. To get to my last point, very briefly, I jump Hungary and other, because we see this already happening in other countries, in Poland and in Hungary, how this actually works, how this really is transformed into policies. And that's really very interesting to look at. I just want to kind of, as an outlook, as a final point, mention that there is a lot of mobilization going on, especially in Latin America, and that this is often overlooked and not seen and not recognized within the European context, but I think increasingly acknowledged, of how to transform this and how to politicize this, how to transform this care issue into a mobilizing issue with, for example, notions of caring democracy as proposed by Joan Tronto, kind of to rethink democracy from the needs of the living, from care. And what is negotiated, what is debated, what is politicized here are notions of autonomy, of precarity, of social vulnerability, and finally of conviviality. And I just want to point out the obvious, I'm sure you know, but I think it's really also for, the work done in the center, a very promising nexus, that there is so much very important work done, especially in Latin America, on políticas del cuidado. Karina works on that, and many others. And I think it's really would be very kind of fruitful to exchange and to see how these care crisis, which is global, but also with its regional specificities, how this plays out and how we might learn from each other and enrich also the political mobilization. Thank you.